Welcome to my brief introduction to the Battle of Bentonville. I kind of want to cover most of the same material that I talked about during our briefing at the last IDT around the sand pit. I'm just going to cover the lead up to the battle, and I'm also going to cover some basics of Civil War combat just so that everybody's a little more familiar with them. And just for clarity, I'll say Union and Federal sometimes, and I mean the Northern Army. And I'll say Confederate and Southern for the Confederate Army. All right, for the overall strategic situation, General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia that we talked about in our Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville staff ride prep, they are holed up at a place called Petersburg, just south of Richmond, and the Union Army has them surrounded. And they're mostly sustained by war material coming in, especially from England, that's coming into Wilmington. Wilmington, and by this point, is the last big port in the Confederacy that's not been taken over. And there's a railroad that runs straight north out of Wilmington called the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. And that's the main supply route for Confederate material going up to Petersburg. Meanwhile, around Atlanta, the Union has taken Atlanta. A general named Sherman has announced that he has come up with kind of a new idea. He's just going to sever his supply lines. He's going to march his army through the countryside, and they're going to take what they want from the civilians. Not only does this damage the economy, but also the Confederacy has to then provide food to the civilians so they don't starve to death. Sherman marches to the sea. He takes Savannah around Christmas. He turns north into South Carolina. He burns Columbia, and then his next target is going to be Fayetteville. There's a arsenal there in Fayetteville that's been producing weapons for the Confederacy. He's going to burn that. Meanwhile, down in Wilmington area, the Union Army has finally made a pretty serious attempt to take Wilmington. They've landed at Fort Fisher. Fort Fisher falls in January. They push north towards Wilmington. The guy who's actually in command, his name's General Terry. He gets relieved because he's taken too long to take Wilmington and get going. They bring in a general named Schofield. Schofield takes Wilmington. He then pushes north. He's going to link up with guys coming out of New Bern, which has been occupied through most of the war. Those two elements are going to meet up around Kinston. They fight against the Confederates that are defending that area at a battle called Wise Forks, or Second Kinston. And then they're going to move towards Goldsboro. And the goal is that Sherman coming north out of Fayetteville and them coming west from Kinston, they're all going to meet up in Goldsboro, consolidate, resupply, and then they're going to push towards Raleigh and attempt to basically gut the Confederacy, or they can move north and support General Grant's operations against General Lee. The Confederates are pretty desperate at this point. Most of the Confederate Army of Tennessee out west has been shredded at the Battle of Franklin. General Johnston has been kind of screening in front of Sherman. He's not really able to do much about him, but he maintains that contact. There's a small battle on March 10th of 1865 at Monroe's Crossroads, which is actually out in the Fort Bragg training areas. The next day, Fayetteville falls. On the 16th, they fight a battle at a place called Aversboro. The Confederates are able to defend their position, and then they withdraw during the night. And General Johnston, while he's withdrawing and screening, he's pulling in all these other garrisons. The Charleston garrison, there's guys in Greenville, Hoke's Division, whoever made it out of Wilmington. And they're all going to rally up and use Smithfield as their assembly area. And their goal is to fight Sherman, who they think has about 38,000 men, which is wrong. He's got about 60,000. And they're going to try to defeat him and then turn and fight all those guys coming out of Kinston. All right, well, here I am in my Civil War uniform. Predominantly, the armies of the Civil War were overwhelmingly infantry armies. And that's kind of what I wanted to start with, was the infantry. So the main weapon I've got, this is a percussion rifled muzzle loading rifle. This one is an Enfield. It's made in England. The American-made Springfield is very, very similar. Both sides use both weapons. Both sides imported them pretty widely. They function about the same. As far as my clothing, you're probably all laughing about that right now. It's made of wool. There's not a lot to it. It'll keep you warm even when it's wet. My uniform's pretty ragged by this point because I am a federal soldier at Bentonville, and I've been tramping through the undergrowth around Fayetteville. We all know how that can be. For my actual survival gear, I have a wool blanket. You can kind of see the end of it right there. I have a rubber blanket. That's really my only wet weather equipment. And I've just rolled them up and thrown them over my shoulder. A lot of guys did that. I've done it on a long march. It's not too bad. I have a canteen for water. And I have a haversack, and this is all of my food and food-related items are going to go in here. Beyond that, I've got a cartridge box. That is for my actual bullets. I have a cap pouch, and I'll explain what that is here in just a minute. And I also have a bayonet for my rifle musket. The bayonets, you'll notice they have this kind of weird crook here to it. That's so that I can continue to load my weapon. Even though the bayonet's fixed, I'm not going to cut my hand up when I ram a cartridge. Bayonets were used and issued throughout the war. Typically, when you got to a bayonet charge, one side would decide they weren't interested and break and run. So there's not a whole lot of actual bayonet combat during the war. To load this weapon, this is kind of the standard. Better weapons had come out right before the war, but they decided they didn't want to invest in a whole new system right before the war because it may not work that well. So what I'll do is I'll bring the weapon down. I'll reach behind me. I'll pull out a cartridge. This is a wrapped up paper cartridge. It's got a bullet and gunpowder and a little paper tail. I would take that, I'd actually bite the end, rip it off, pour everything down the muzzle, kind of start it with my thumb. I'd use my rammer, push everything down to the bottom. Also, if you ever encounter a muzzle-loading weapon, that's basically how you check and make sure that there's nothing in there, is you just pull that rammer and let it ping off the bottom. So at this point, I've got the gunpowder and the bullet in here. I'd bring it up, I would reach into my cap pouch, and I'd get a percussion cap. This is basically like a shotgun primer today. I would put that right here on the weapon. At that point, it's ready to fire. A well-trained soldier in the period was expected to get off about 3 rounds a minute, and you would learn that loading drill over and over and over and over. They actually didn't do a ton of target practice, and part of the reason is once you get going in a firefight, you're going to have an enormous cloud of smoke in front of your position, and it's going to be kind of hard to see what's going on anyway. The sights on this weapon are pretty rudimentary. The American-made Springfield in particular just has a 300 and a 600 yard sight setting, so there's a real steep arc when you fire it. In a lot of Civil War battles, most of the rounds are passing over my head, and most of my shots are passing over the enemy's head. Soldiers would be taught to fire in volleys, so they would all fire at once. Typically, once everything got going, though, you're just going to stand there and load and fire as fast as you can. So here I am in my currently very unpopular North Carolina Confederate uniform. I do want to say it's not any kind of political statement. They were at Bentonville. They're part of the story. Equipment, pretty similar to the northern equipment, just different construction, different color. I do want to say a few words about muzzleloading weapons and their impact on tactics. So you'll notice it's a lot easier for me to do some of these motions while I'm standing up. You would have been taught how to do them from the prone, but to achieve a good rate of fire, you're going to need to stand up to generate that fire. And so a Civil War soldier's ideal of bravery is going to be to basically stand there and take whatever's coming at him. If he were to watch a modern firefight, he would be a little bit confused when everybody immediately dove for cover and started maneuvering. As the war progressed and people realized that they don't in fact want to die, they start doing a lot of fortifications, and we may see some of those on the tour. What a fortification does is it allows me to stand up and do my loading thing without having to expose my entire body to enemy fire. If I can just expose, this much, or even from the waist up, that's a pretty big improvement, because that's less of me that is going to be potentially shot. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about the leadership here because I don't want to steal anybody's thunder on the tour stops. But I do want to talk a little bit about command and control as far as communication. Up here on the screen, I've got the order that was handed to Colonel Starr, the Confederate artillery commander, telling him to get off the battlefield on the 21st of March. This is pretty typical of a Civil War field order. Somebody's going to come galloping up on a horse. They're either going to hand you this note or they're going to yell in your ear what they want you to do. And I'm leaving this order up so you can kind of look at it. It's a little hard to read. It's kind of easy to misinterpret. They're starting to understand that this is a problem. So much so that in 1895, an Army captain named Swift comes up with a 5-paragraph order. And it's originally a little notepad that you would write like a sentence for each paragraph and just rip it off and hand it to somebody who could then take it to the appropriate leader. The Army doesn't really go with it at this point, but that's kind of considered the beginning of the 5-paragraph order. Okay, for maneuver, they're going to be doing close order drill on the battlefield, just like we march around. They're typically going to fight in a 2-rank formation, so they have different drill systems to get into that 2 ranks quickly. In a lot of these pictures that I'm putting up, you'll see drummers or buglers, and those guys they're giving commands, like bugle calls and drum beats would be giving commands to the unit. The officers are yelling, of course, but with everything going on, you're just going to yell yourself hoarse in about 10 minutes and then kind of be out of the fight. So that's really how they command and control while they're doing maneuvers. Things would get a little chaotic, especially in a big attack, and units would start to get mixed up. And then you're going to have to kind of halt at the end of that attack and straighten everything out. For intelligence in the period, it's pretty pitiful. You have a lot of rumor, a lot of looking at the other side's newspapers. Sherman in particular hates reporters, so he usually keeps them out of his army. But the intelligence services on both sides, they're starting to get a little better as the war goes on, but they're still pretty bad. There's a kind of a big incident where they're marching to the town of Elevation, North Carolina, because they think there's a road that cuts through it. And they get there and that road intersection doesn't exist because the maps they're using are out of date and incorrect. And I'll put up a map here on the screen. This is an actual Confederate map. I don't have any better photos of it because the state archives are closed right now, but this should kind of give you an idea of how rudimentary that's going to be. All right, for fires, we talked a little bit about infantry at the beginning. Cavalry, typically by this point, would have fought kind of like infantry. They would have dismounted and fought with their carbines. Your main long-range fires are provided by the artillery. The artillery would have worked usually in batteries of 4 to 6 guns. They would have been horse-drawn, so they could move around the battlefield a little bit faster than the infantry. But they're not engaging targets beyond visual range. It's all direct fire. You would have to see your target to be able to engage it. And they have a couple of different kinds of shells. They have canister, which is just a great big shotgun round of pellets. They have spherical case, which is an explosive round, and then they have solid shot, which is what we would think of as a cannonball. It's just a solid ball. The spherical case, the way you use that is it will have a time fuse that starts when you fire the gun. So you would estimate your range, and then you would cut the fuse so that it would burn for a certain amount of time as it's flying through the air out to that range. And then you want it ideally to go off in front of the opposing troops. And that shell, the casing of it, is going to break apart and provide shrapnel. And that's going to kind of rain down on those enemy troops. All right, so sustainment. And this kind of plays into protection. This is where the Civil War gets really gross and disgusting and kind of appalling. Food, generally you would be issued kind of in advance. A lot of times when you see an order for a campaign, it'll say, issue the men 4 days food or 3 days food and have it cooked and ready. So your food staples are hardtack, which I do not have an intact piece of hardtack. It's all been smashed up. Think something along the lines of like a giant MRE cracker that's really thick. It's just flour and water baked together. Usually it's best to soften it with something, and it has very little nutritional value. I've also got some, this is salt beef that I prepared years ago. It's probably not safe to eat anymore. They did a lot of salted meat. You're going to have to boil it to make it edible. And it's not actually cooked. It's just preserved in salt. The salt keeps bacteria from growing. That's about all that's going on with that. You can just hold it over a fire. You can make it into a stew. There's kind of some different options. I've also got some green coffee beans. These would just have to be roasted, probably on this plate over a fire, and then smashed up. And then they're coffee. You would just pour boiling water over them. It is kind of a big thing in the Civil War. To prepare your rations, you need to stop and build a fire. You don't have like a meal that's ready to eat. You have to actually sit there and do a little bit of cooking. Sherman's guys in particular were sustaining off the local economy, so they were doing a lot of whatever was available in the area, cornmeal. They would literally just kick down people's doors and go into their homes and just take whatever food that they wanted. For water, this is your canteen. This one had a bunch of rust in it when I opened it earlier. And there was no supply of water, like a water bowl that we would think of. You literally just fill that thing up when you hit like a creek or a stream or something. And this kind of feeds into protection because before the First World War, anytime you send an army into the field, you're going to have more men die of disease than die of combat. That's just the reality. Just putting troops in the field, you're going to have casualties. And that kind of results in an attitude where human life doesn't mean a whole lot. The medical services on both sides of the Civil War were never a huge priority. And that kind of comes from that attitude of, well, you might just die anyway of dysentery or, bad food. So why are we going to invest a lot of effort into recovering you and getting you well again and sending you back in? Both sides struggle with that. In the North, it actually kind of comes along, and they come out with a pretty well-developed medical system for the era. They still don't understand germs, and that's why this food, it's pretty bad. If you look in all descriptions of the inside of a haversack are about how disgusting they are. You hear about guys cleaning their fork just by jamming it in the dirt a couple times. People just didn't understand the idea of germ theory, so they're constantly getting sick all through the war. Well, if you've stuck with me to the end, this has been a very, very brief, I know it doesn't feel that way, introduction to Civil War and talking about some of the warfighting functions, some of the branches of service, some of the basics of Civil War combat. Obviously, I'm really into this stuff, so if you have any questions before the staff ride, just email me and be aware that you might get a fairly long response. And thank you all for listening.